May 10, 1945. Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, British Interrogation Centre. The cigarette trembled slightly as Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal sat across from his British interrogator, recording words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals and faith, I would abandon this work as having proved myself a failure. These were not Kuhlenthal's words. They were the words of his most prized agent, Juan Pujol García, codename Arabelle, written in fury when German radio operators had missed his warning about D-Day on June 6, 1944. Kuhlenthal had believed every word, had defended this agent to Berlin, had staked his reputation on the intelligence Arabelle provided. Now, in this interrogation room, he was learning that his greatest intelligence triumph had been his most catastrophic failure. For 4 years, the former Abwehr officer had run what he believed was Nazi Germany's most successful spy network in Britain, 27 agents feeding him detailed intelligence about Allied military preparations. The Germans were so convinced by this network that they made no further attempts to recruit any additional spies in the UK. What Kuhlenthal didn't know, what no one in German intelligence knew, was that every single one of these agents was fictional, created by one man sitting in a modest house in Hendon, North London, working for British intelligence. The mathematics of deception were staggering. Over 500 radio messages between January 1944 and D-Day, at times more than 20 messages per day. 315 letters, averaging 2,000 words each. No fewer than 62 of Pujol's reports were included in OKW intelligence summaries. And the ultimate result? 2 armoured divisions and 19 infantry divisions held in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for a second invasion through July and August 1944. The collapse had begun long before anyone realised. By 1941, German military intelligence, the Abwehr, faced a crisis they couldn't admit even to themselves. Between September and November 1940, fewer than 25 agents arrived in the country. Mostly of Eastern European extraction, they were badly trained and poorly motivated. Every spy sent to Britain had been captured, turned, or executed. The vaunted German intelligence service was blind. In Madrid, the Abwehr station operated from an elegant building on Calle Fernando el Santo, maintaining the facade of diplomatic normalcy while desperately seeking any source of intelligence from Britain. The station chief, Wilhelm Leisner, alias Gustav Lenz, had failed to establish even a single reliable agent in the British Isles. His deputy, Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, was increasingly frustrated. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris had taken a shine to Kuhlenthal to the extent that Leisner was effectively superseded. Kuhlenthal was a complicated figure in Nazi intelligence. Kuhlenthal was a Mischling, a half-blood Jew with a Jewish grandmother, but Canaris had managed to secure an Aryan certificate for him in 1941. Perhaps this background, forever on the edge of acceptance, always needing to prove his worth, made him particularly eager to believe in success when it finally appeared to arrive. The pressure from Berlin was relentless. The Wehrmacht needed to know British strength, deployment, morale, preparations. The Luftwaffe needed target information. The Kriegsmarine needed convoy schedules. And Kuhlenthal had nothing. Then, in January 1941, a small, unremarkable Spaniard walked into the German embassy in Madrid. Juan Pujol García didn't look like a master spy. At 29 years old, he was a failed chicken farmer, a hotel manager of modest success, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who had somehow managed to serve on both sides without distinction. Developing a hatred for the communist and fascist regimes, Pujol was determined to make a contribution to the good of humanity during the Second World War. His first attempts at espionage were almost comically unsuccessful. He initially approached the British no less than 3 times. However, they showed no interest in hiring him as a spy. The British embassy in Madrid, bombarded daily with offers from Spanish opportunists, saw nothing special in this earnest little man with his claims of wanting to help defeat fascism. But Pujol had a plan. If the British wouldn't take him as an agent, he would become a German agent first, then offer himself to the British as a double agent. He turned to the Abwehr office in Madrid and offered to spy for Germany. Again, the Abwehr showed little interest initially in his offer to spy for them. But Pujol was persistent and persuaded the Abwehr officials that he had a visa to travel to London as a Spanish diplomat. His persistence wore down Gustav Leisner, the Abwehr recruiter. After months of repeated visits, increasingly elaborate stories, and fervent pro-Nazi speeches that would have embarrassed Goebbels, Leisner finally passed him to Kühlenthal. The major was sceptical but desperate. Here was a Spaniard with supposed diplomatic cover, claiming he could get to Britain. After a few days of instruction in the techniques of spying, Garcia was told not to engage in any espionage work in England. Instead, he was to recruit agents and was given an accommodation address in Spain, where he should send his secret messages. They gave him $3,000, invisible ink, codename Arabelle, and instructions to build a network in Britain. On July 19, 1941, Pujol left Madrid, supposedly bound for Britain. Kühlenthal waited eagerly for the first reports from his new agent in London. Pujol never went to Britain. Instead, he went to Lisbon, Portugal, where he checked into a modest hotel and began one of the most audacious deceptions in intelligence history. Visiting the Lisbon Library, he created fake reports based on a Spanish translation of the Frommer's Guide to England, a tourist manual, magazines, reference books, railway schedules, maps, and newsreels. Sitting in Portuguese cafes, studying tourist guides and old British newspapers, Pujol began constructing an imaginary Britain. He invented weather patterns, train schedules, troop movements. He created a vocabulary of British life gleaned from guidebooks, ration books, blackouts, air raid warnings. Every detail had to ring true to Germans who had never been to Britain. His first report to Kühlenthal was tentative, general observations about British morale and weather. The response was encouraging. Berlin was interested. Emboldened, Pujol began to expand his fiction. He invented his first sub-agent, a Portuguese commercial traveller named Carvalho, who travelled extensively for business and could report from different parts of Britain. The reports grew more detailed, convoy movements from Liverpool, which Pujol placed in the wrong location on the map. Troop concentrations in Scotland, entirely fictional. Aircraft production figures, invented wholesale. Each report carefully included enough accurate information, gleaned from newspapers that eventually reached Lisbon, to seem credible, mixed with complete fabrications. But Pujol made mistakes that should have exposed him immediately. He reported on the Glasgow dockers who would do anything for a litre of wine, not knowing that British beer was served in pints, not litres, and that wine was rarely drunk by dock workers. He described trains running from London to Glasgow in times that would have required speeds impossible on British railways. He placed the British Army divisions in locations that any competent map check would have revealed as impossible. Yet Kühlenthal believed every word. By late 1941, Pujol realised he needed help. His deception was becoming too complex to maintain alone from Lisbon. He also invented a vast network of non-existent spies. At its peak, they numbered 27, including a Swiss banker in London, a Venetian dock worker in Glasgow, and a KLM pilot who flew the route between Britain and Portugal. Each fictional agent had a personality, a background, specific access to intelligence. The Swiss banker, given the designation J2, could report on financial matters and government policy. The Venezuelan student, J3, was perfectly placed at a Scottish military base. An unnamed Gibraltarian waiter, J4, worked in canteens where officers talked freely. To explain how his reports reached Lisbon, Pujol invented an airline employee who carried them on the London-Lisbon route. This explained the Portuguese postmarks and the delays in transmission. When the Germans demanded faster communication after Operation Torch, Pujol and Harris created a fictitious radio operator. Meanwhile, in London, British intelligence was becoming aware of a mysterious German agent. Through ultra-intercepts, the top-secret program that had broken the German Enigma code, they could read Abwehr communications. They kept seeing references to an agent Arabelle who was supposedly in Britain, sending intelligence that was demonstrably wrong, but was being believed by the Germans. MI5 was alarmed. Who was this agent? How had he evaded their comprehensive surveillance network? Every report was analysed, every claim checked. The answer seemed impossible. The agent didn't exist in Britain at all. By February 1942, MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, had heard of Garbo even though he was not then an agent of theirs. They learned of Garbo's work via Ultra, decrypts of German radio messages encoded on Enigma machines. The British were reading German intelligence reports about their own country that were completely fabricated, yet the Germans believed them absolutely. In Lisbon, Pujol was growing desperate. His deception was becoming unsustainable. He needed British help, but his previous approaches had been rejected. Finally, in February 1942, he made contact with the American naval attaché in Lisbon, Lieutenant Patrick Demarest. This time, presenting evidence of his correspondence with the Germans, Pujol was taken seriously. After a bitter dispute between the various British intelligence services about what to do with Garcia, he was finally smuggled out of Lisbon via boat bound for Gibraltar. Once safely in Gibraltar, he was sent to England. He landed in Plymouth on April 24, 1942. At the docks, two men waited, Cyril Mills and Tomas Harris of MI5. Harris, half Spanish himself and fluent in the language, would become Pujol's handler and the co-architect of the greatest deception in military history. Mills suggested that Pujol's code name should be changed as befitted the best actor in the world, and Pujol became Garbo, after Greta Garbo. The British were astounded by what Pujol had achieved alone. Working from Lisbon with only guidebooks and newspapers, he had created an entire intelligence network that German intelligence believed completely. Now, with the resources of MI5 behind him, the deception could become something far greater. The modest two-storey house at 35 Crespigny Road in Hendon, North London, became the nerve centre of one of the war's most crucial operations. The unassuming 1920s suburban house became both Pujol's home and his workplace. Here, Pujol and Harris would spend countless hours crafting the fiction that would help save thousands of Allied lives. Every day, Pujol and Harris met to compose messages to the Germans. Each communication had to maintain the voice and personality of whichever sub-agent was supposedly reporting. The Swiss banker wrote in formal, cautious prose. The Venezuelan student was enthusiastic but naive. The communist seaman was bitter about capitalism but loyal to his paymaster. Harris soon created a convincing identity for Garbo, supplying the Germans with both useful chicken feed and a mass of deceptions. Real military information, carefully selected to be either harmless or arriving too late to be useful, was mixed with crucial deceptions. The art was in the balance. Too much false information and the Germans would grow suspicious. Too much truth and actual damage could be done. The network continued to grow. When Pujol needed to explain why he hadn't reported ship movements from Liverpool, he simply killed off his agent there. To support this story, the British created an obituary for the non-existent spy which they published in the local paper. By early 1943, Garbo's network had become so complex that organisational charts were needed to track the fictional agents. Each had their own subplot, their own access, their own personality quirks. Some fell in love, others fell ill, some demanded more money, others proved disappointingly unreliable. All of it fiction, all of it believed. In Madrid, Karl Erich Kuhlenthal had become completely dependent on the Arabelle network. The intelligence was so voluminous, so detailed, so apparently reliable, that he stopped trying to recruit new agents in Britain. Why risk new infiltrations when Arabelle provided everything Berlin needed? When Canaris, the Abwehr chief, visited Spain, Kühlenthal was the star turn. He boasted of his agent network, showing off particularly clever pieces of intelligence. In March 1943, Garbo had even sent them a cake with an RAF handbook baked inside, the chocolate icing reading, "With good wishes to Odette." Canaris was delighted by such ingenuity. The Germans paid handsomely for this intelligence. By 1943, they were funding all 27 of Garbo's fictional agents, sending thousands of dollars through various channels. The money, carefully tracked by MI5, went into British government coffers. The Germans were literally funding their own deception. But Kühlenthal wasn't just passing on Garbo's intelligence, he was embellishing it. Many of his elaborations were either wrong or meaningless. He also made some hilarious mistakes, including his conviction that the Isle of Man is in the north of Ireland. His desperation to please Berlin made him add details that Garbo had never provided, creating an even more elaborate fiction. The relationship between handler and agent had become almost symbiotic. Kühlenthal needed Arabelle to maintain his position and reputation. Garbo played on this dependency brilliantly. The more we dictated our terms, Pujol noted, the more they cooperated. The more arrogant and temperamental Garbo became, the more considerate they were in return. By January 1944, the stakes had become existential. The Germans told Pujol that they believed that the Allies were preparing for a large-scale invasion of Europe, and that they looked to him to keep them informed. Everything Garbo and Harris had built over 3 years would now face its ultimate test. The deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was breathtaking in scope. The Allies needed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point from England to France, not at Normandy, where it would actually occur. Moreover, even after the Normandy landings, the Germans had to believe it was merely a diversion. The skeleton of the new force already existed in the form of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by Omar Bradley. It had been formed for administrative purposes but never used, but the Germans had discovered its existence through radio intercepts. Now it would be transformed into a phantom army of 150,000 men under General George Patton. Garbo's network went into overdrive. Between January 1944 and D-Day, over 500 radio messages, 4 transmissions a day, passed between Garbo and Madrid, who in turn retransmitted them direct to Berlin. Each message added another layer to the deception: troop movements, supply build-ups, training exercises, all pointing to Pas-de-Calais. Agent 3, the Venezuelan, reported extensive military preparations in Scotland. Agent 7, a Welsh ex-seaman, described shipping concentrations in Dover. Agent 4-3, an American sergeant, detailed Patton's presence in southeast England. Each report reinforced the fiction. The 1st United States Army Group was real, it was massive, and it was aimed at Pas-de-Calais. As D-Day approached, Garbo and Harris faced an almost impossible challenge. To maintain credibility, Garbo had to warn the Germans about the invasion, but not in time for them to respond effectively. The timing would be everything. Special arrangements were made with the German radio operators to be listening to Garbo through the night of the 5th of June 1944, using the story that a sub-agent was about to arrive with important information. However, when the call was made at 3 a.m., no reply was received from the German operators until 8 a.m. This failure by the Germans to respond became a masterstroke of the deception. When contact was finally established, hours after Allied paratroopers had begun landing, Garbo transmitted accurate information about the invasion, but it was already too late to be useful. Then came his fury at being ignored. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon the work." The Germans were mortified. Their most valuable agent had risked everything to warn them, and they had failed to listen. Kulenthal sent grovelling apologies to his prize agent, but the real deception was yet to come. 3 days after the Normandy landings, with Allied forces desperately trying to establish their beachhead against fierce German resistance, Garbo sent the most important message of the war. It was long, detailed, and urgent, demanding immediate transmission to the highest levels of German command. The message, crafted by Garbo and Harris over intense hours, reported that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real invasion, led by Patton's First Army Group, would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Garbo's agents throughout Britain confirmed it. The forces that had landed in Normandy were secondary. The main army remained in southeast England, waiting. A German message to Madrid sent 2 days later said, "All reports received in the last week from Arabelle, spy network codename, undertaking have been confirmed without exception and are to be described as especially valuable." The message went directly to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the German High Command. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel read it. Colonel General Alfred Jodl analysed it. It reached Hitler himself at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden. The German response was immediate and decisive. The 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais, over 200,000 men, would remain in position. The 1st SS Panzer Division, already moving toward Normandy, was ordered to halt. The 116th Panzer Division stayed in reserve north of the Seine. OKW accepted Garbo's report so completely that they kept 2 armoured divisions and 19 infantry divisions in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for a second invasion through July and August 1944. At Wehrmacht headquarters, the intelligence from Agent Arabelle was treated as gospel. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, had argued for moving the 15th Army to Normandy as early as June 8th. Hitler, influenced by Garbo's reports, refused. The Phantom Army in southeast England could not be ignored. Such was the success of Fortitude that many units were kept away from the Normandy battlefield until July. Week after week, as Allied forces consolidated their bridgehead, expanded their perimeter, and built up for the breakout, German forces waited at Pas-de-Calais for an invasion that would never come. The German intelligence services were completely deceived about Allied strength. They believed the Allies had 89 divisions in Britain when the real number was 47. They believed Patton commanded a massive army group when he was actually in disgrace, waiting to be given a real command. They believed Norway was threatened by a British Fourth Army in Scotland that existed only in Garbo's messages. Even after the Allies broke out from Normandy in late July, even as they raced across France in August, some German commanders still believed the real invasion hadn't happened yet. Garbo's reports had created a strategic paralysis that lasted months beyond D-Day. On July 29, 1944, as Allied armies surged across France, a remarkable message arrived from Germany. He was informed that he had been awarded the Iron Cross by the Führer himself for his extraordinary services to Germany. By return message, Pujol and Harris expressed Garbo's humble thanks for such an honour, for which he was truly unworthy. The irony was extraordinary. Hitler had personally awarded Germany's prestigious military decoration to a British double agent who had helped ensure the Third Reich's defeat. In the same year, King George VI would secretly award Pujol the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for the same actions. He became one of the only people to receive high decorations from both sides in the war. The award of the Iron Cross demonstrated the complete German faith in Garbo. Even as their armies retreated, even as the evidence of deception should have become clear, they never suspected their most trusted agent was their greatest enemy. By September 1944, with Allied armies approaching the German border, MI5 faced a delicate problem. Following a scare that Pujol was about to be exposed as a British double agent, it was decided that he should go to ground, although his network continued to provide misleading information to the Germans. The fiction was maintained that Garbo had to flee, fearing arrest by British authorities who were closing in on his network. But his sub-agents continued reporting, maintaining the deception even as the Third Reich crumbled. Some agents reported on non-existent communist infiltration in the Allied armies. Others described fictional tensions between American and British forces. The Germans never stopped believing. Even as Berlin fell, even as the Wehrmacht surrendered, German intelligence files showed they still considered the Garbo network their most reliable source of intelligence from Britain. Which brings us back to that interrogation room in Luxembourg, May 1945. Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal sat across from British intelligence officers who were slowly, methodically, revealing the truth about Agent Arabelle. The British interrogator laid out document after document. Here were Garbo's messages. Here were the German responses. Here were the movement orders that kept divisions at Pas-de-Calais. Here were the intelligence summaries that went to Hitler himself. And here was the truth. Every single agent in the network was fictional. Kuhlenthal's world collapsed. For 4 years he had staked his reputation, his career, his life on Agent Arabelle. He had defended him against doubters, had argued for resources to fund the network, had boasted to Canaris himself about his intelligence coup. Kuhlenthal's reports were very well received in Berlin, albeit that, from a British point of view, Kuhlenthal was so easily duped that he was worse than useless. The interrogator showed him a photograph. A small, unremarkable Spanish man with a slight smile, Juan Pujol García, the failed chicken farmer who had walked into the German embassy in Madrid 4 years earlier. The man who, working from a suburban house in North London, had created an intelligence network so convincing that German High Command had based their strategy on it. 27 agents, the interrogator said. All fictional. All paid for by German intelligence. All created by one man and his British handler. Kuhlenthal said nothing. There was nothing to say. The numbers, when finally tallied, were staggering. The Garbo network had sent over 500 radio messages in the crucial months before D-Day. The Germans had paid approximately $340,000 in 1940s currency to fund fictional agents. The deception had kept over 500,000 German soldiers away from Normandy during the critical weeks after D-Day. Military historians would later calculate that Operation Fortitude, with Garbo as its centrepiece, had shortened the war in Europe by months, possibly a year. The divisions kept at Pas-de-Calais could have turned the Normandy battle into a bloodbath. Their absence allowed the Allies to establish, reinforce and break out from their beachhead. But the impact went beyond military statistics. The German intelligence services never recovered from the psychological blow. If their most trusted, most productive network had been entirely fictional, what else had they missed? What other deceptions had they swallowed? At the Nuremberg trials, German generals would cite the intelligence failure as a key factor in their defeat. They had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and outdeceived by an enemy they had underestimated. Field Marshal Keitel, asked about the failure to respond to Normandy, could only reference the intelligence that suggested Pas-de-Calais was the real target. For years after the war, the secret was kept. The techniques of the double-cross system, the methods of strategic deception, the identity of the agents, all remained classified. German intelligence officers went to their graves never knowing the full extent of their deception. Kuhlenthal himself returned to Germany after his interrogation and lived quietly until his death on October 25, 1975. Whether he ever fully accepted that his entire wartime achievement had been a British fiction remains unknown. Some who knew him said he continued to insist that Arabelle must have had some real agents, that the entire network couldn't have been fictional. Juan Pujol García disappeared after the war. With the help of MI5, Pujol travelled to Angola and faked his death from malaria in 1949. He then moved to Lagunillas, Venezuela, where he lived in relative anonymity running a bookstore and gift shop. For 36 years he lived in obscurity, his own children not knowing their father's true history. It wasn't until 1984 that historian Rupert Allison writing under the name Nigel West, finally tracked down Garbo in Venezuela. The revelation stunned the intelligence world. The greatest double agent of World War II was still alive, running a gift shop in Caracas. In 1984, at age 72, Juan Pujol García returned to London for the first time since the war. At Buckingham Palace, in a private ceremony, the Duke of Edinburgh thanked him on behalf of the nation. Veterans of D-Day, learning for the first time about the deception that had saved many of their lives, lined up to shake his hand. He visited 35 Crespigny Road, now occupied by a family who had no idea their modest home had been the centre of one of the war's most crucial operations. He met with surviving members of MI5, intelligence officers who had studied his case for decades without knowing if he was still alive. But perhaps the most poignant moment came when he was shown German intelligence files from the war. Page after page of reports, analysis, commendations, all based on his fiction. Payment receipts for agents who never existed. Operational orders based on his deceptions. The entire architecture of German intelligence failure, preserved in meticulous German documentation. Did they really believe it all? Pujol asked his former handler. Every word, came the reply. They believed every word. Military historians have studied the Garbo deception as perhaps the most successful single intelligence operation of the Second World War. How did one man, with the help of his handler, deceive an entire intelligence apparatus? How did fictional agents become more trusted than real ones? The answer lay partly in German psychology. The Nazi regime, built on propaganda and self-deception, was peculiarly vulnerable to believing what it wanted to believe. The Germans expected to have spies in Britain. Therefore, when Garbo appeared, they accepted him. They expected the Allies to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Therefore, when Garbo confirmed it, they believed him. But the deeper answer lay in the artistry of the deception. Garbo and Harris didn't just send intelligence, they created a world. Each agent had personality, motivation, strengths and weaknesses. The network had internal conflicts, romantic entanglements, financial problems, all the messy humanity that made it feel real. After the war, former Abwehr agents explained that it was better to send in numerous false reports than few or none at all. The alternative was to be sent to the front. This pressure to produce intelligence, regardless of quality, created a system where volume was valued over verification, where impressive reports were more important than accurate ones. Behind the statistics and strategic impact were human stories. Every German division held at Pas-de-Calais meant Allied soldiers who lived instead of died on Normandy beaches. Every day the Germans waited for the real invasion meant another day for Allied forces to strengthen their position. Estimates suggest Operation Fortitude saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Soldiers who stormed Omaha Beach, who fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, who broke out in Operation Cobra, many owed their survival to a Spanish double agent they never knew existed. On the German side, the cost was catastrophic. Divisions that could have thrown the Allies back into the sea sat idle, waiting for phantom armies. Young German soldiers died in Normandy, while reinforcements waited at Pas-de-Calais for an invasion that never came. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the Atlantic defences, had argued desperately for moving forces to Normandy in the critical days after June 6th. Overruled by Hitler based on intelligence from Agent Arabelle, he watched his outnumbered forces slowly ground down. The Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated commander, was ultimately defeated not by Allied tanks, but by fictional intelligence from a Barcelona chicken farmer. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Garbo story was how close it came to never happening. 3 times Pujol had approached the British and been rejected. If British intelligence had been slightly more receptive in 1941, if they had accepted his offer immediately, the deception might never have developed its unique character. It was precisely because Pujol had to create his network alone, from Lisbon, with only tourist guides and imagination, that it developed such distinctive authenticity. The mistakes he made, placing ships in the wrong ports, getting British culture slightly wrong, actually made the intelligence more believable to Germans who expected foreign agents to make such errors. The network's very implausibility became its strength. Who would imagine that 27 agents were all fictional? Who would believe that Germany's most productive intelligence network was run by a single man in suburban London? The deception was so audacious that, suspecting it required an imaginative leap, the German intelligence services proved incapable of making. When the full story of Garbo was finally revealed in the 1970s and 1980s, it sent shockwaves through intelligence communities worldwide. The double-cross system, of which Garbo was the crown jewel, had turned every German agent in Britain. After the war, it was discovered that all the agents Germany sent to Britain had given themselves up or had been captured. For surviving German intelligence officers, the revelation was devastating. They had to reassess every intelligence evaluation they had made, every operational decision based on agent reports. The foundation of their wartime intelligence work had been not just flawed, but entirely fictional. One former Abwehr officer, interviewed in the 1980s, simply couldn't accept it. There must have been some real agents, he insisted. Arabelle couldn't have invented everything. The details were too precise, too accurate. When shown the evidence, Garbo's handwritten messages, the MI5 files, the payment records, he fell silent, then said quietly, "Then we never had a chance." Even after the German surrender, the Garbo network sent one final cluster of messages. These reached Madrid in the chaos of May 1945, with Nazi Germany collapsing and Kulenthal himself about to be arrested. The messages warned of communist infiltration in the Allied armies, of secret Soviet agreements, of tensions that would define the post-war world. They were, like everything else from Garbo, carefully crafted fiction designed to serve British interests. But unlike the wartime messages, these would never be acted upon. The Third Reich was dead, its intelligence services shattered, its officers facing interrogation and trial. The final message from the Garbo network was dated May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's surrender. It reported that Agent 3, the Venezuelan student who never existed, had been arrested by British counterintelligence. It was a fitting end to the fiction, a fake arrest of a fictional agent, reported to an intelligence service that would cease to exist within days. Juan Pujol García died on October 10, 1988, in Caracas, Venezuela. He was 76 years old. His death was reported in newspapers worldwide. The chicken farmer who fooled Hitler, the spy who saved D-Day, the man who created an army of ghosts. But his legacy lived on in ways both tangible and intangible. The techniques he pioneered, creating complex, believable fictional networks, became standard in intelligence services worldwide. The principle he demonstrated, that in intelligence perception could be more powerful than reality, influenced Cold War operations for decades. At the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth, a small exhibit tells the story of Agent Garbo. Visitors, many of them descendants of D-Day veterans, learn for the first time about the Spanish double agent who helped their grandfathers survive. The exhibit includes one of Garbo's encrypted messages, its innocuous text hiding the deception that changed history. Back in that interrogation room in Luxembourg, May 1945, the British officer finished laying out the evidence of the Garbo deception to Karl Erich Kulenthal. The German intelligence officer had been silent for nearly an hour, absorbing the magnitude of his failure. Finally, Kulenthal asked a single question. The June 9th message, the one that said Normandy was a diversion, did that come from London? From a house in Hendon, the interrogator confirmed. Written by Garbo and his handler over 6 hours, transmitted by radio to Madrid, retransmitted by you to Berlin. It reached Hitler himself. Kulenthal nodded slowly. Then we lost the war on June 9th, 1944. The interrogator corrected him gently. You lost the war the day you believed Agent Arabelle was real. The final accounting of the Garbo operation reveals its staggering scope. 27 completely fictional agents created and maintained. Over 500 radio messages sent between January and June 1944. 315 letters averaging 2,000 words each throughout the war. $340,000 paid by German intelligence to fund non-existent agents. 62 Garbo reports included in Wehrmacht High Command intelligence summaries. German 15th Army with multiple divisions kept at Pas-de-Calais after D-Day. Panzer reserves held away from Normandy at critical moments. 7 weeks of delay before German High Command accepted Normandy as the main invasion. The mathematics of deception had created a strategic paralysis that allowed the Allies to secure their foothold in Europe. Every fictional agent report, every fabricated troop movement, every invented conversation contributed to a deception so complete that it changed the course of history. Even today, aspects of the Garbo operation remain mysterious. How did Kuhlenthal, described by contemporaries as intelligent and capable, never suspect the deception? How did German intelligence, renowned for its thoroughness, never verify a single one of Garbo's agents? Part of the answer lies in the corruption of the intelligence process itself. According to one intercepted message, Kuhlenthal was said to be running a very expensive agent in London, a Yugoslav diplomat, who had cost the Abwehr £400 over 2 years. There were officers in Spain who were convinced that K was making half-part business, i.e. splitting the monthly allowances between his and the diplomat's pocket. The system rewarded those who produced intelligence, not those who verified it. Kuhlenthal's career depended on Arabelle being real, so he never looked too closely at inconsistencies. Berlin needed intelligence from Britain, so they never questioned their only reliable source. The deception succeeded because everyone involved had reasons to believe it. The success of Agent Garbo represented a perfect storm of factors that might never align again. A volunteer double agent with exceptional imagination. A handler, Thomas Harris, with the cultural knowledge and linguistic skills to enhance the deception. An enemy intelligence service desperate for information and predisposed to believe it. Technology, Ultra, that allowed the deceivers to monitor the deception's success in real time. And a strategic deception, Operation Fortitude, that required exactly the kind of detailed, believable intelligence that Garbo could provide. Remove any of these elements, and the deception might have failed. If Pujol hadn't been so persistent, if Harris hadn't been available as his handler, if the Germans hadn't been so desperate for British intelligence, if Ultra hadn't provided feedback on the deception's success, any of these changes could have unravelled the entire operation. In 1984, at a reunion dinner in London with surviving MI5 officers, Juan Pujol García was asked what motivated him to undertake such a dangerous deception. His answer was simple but profound. I wanted to do something good for humanity. The Nazis were evil. I had seen enough in Spain to know that. If my imagination, my ability to create stories, could help defeat them, then that was my contribution. I had no gun, no bombs, no army, but I had the ability to make the Germans believe whatever I told them. That was my weapon. He paused, then added with a slight smile. And it worked, didn't it? They believed every word. Indeed they had. For 4 crucial years, German intelligence had based their assessments on the reports of Agent Arabelle and his network. They had moved divisions based on his intelligence, allocated resources based on his warnings, made strategic decisions based on his deceptions. The Germans never knew that their most trusted window into British intentions was actually a mirror, reflecting back their own expectations and fears, carefully crafted by a former chicken farmer and a Spanish-speaking art dealer's son working in a modest house in North London. They never knew that the invasion warnings they trusted came from fictional agents who existed only in the imagination of Juan Pujol García. They never knew that their intelligence triumph was actually their intelligence catastrophe. They never knew that Agent Garbo had helped ensure their defeat from the moment he walked into their embassy in Madrid. The story of Agent Garbo remains the supreme example of how in intelligence, as in war, perception can be more powerful than reality. The Germans lost not because they lacked intelligence, but because they trusted the wrong intelligence completely. They had been defeated not by armies or weapons, but by imagination and deception on a scale they never conceived possible. When Karl Erich Kuhlenthal left that interrogation room in Luxembourg, he carried with him the knowledge that everything he had believed, everything he had reported to Berlin, everything he had staked his reputation on had been a lie. The network he had boasted about to Canaris, the agents he had funded so generously, the intelligence he had defended so vigorously, none of it had been real. Somewhere in Venezuela, Juan Pujol García continued running his gift shop, unknown to his customers, his neighbours, even his children. The man who had changed history with his imagination lived quietly, anonymously, carrying the secret of how one person's creativity had defeated the mighty German intelligence service and helped save Western civilization. The Germans never knew, and by the time they learned the truth, it was far too late. The war was over, the Reich was destroyed, and Agent Garbo had entered history as perhaps the most successful double agent who ever lived, the spy who won D-Day with nothing more than imagination, determination, and the German willingness to believe what they desperately wanted to be true.